Okay, we're going to be discussing projection, identification, introjection, and theory of mind. The first three are psychoanalysis or psychoanalytical defense mechanisms, which basically work to protect you from feeling uncomfortable or feeling psychological pain. And theory of mind is a conceptual framework which helps us to basically, or ultimately, it helps us to interact in complex communication with other people. So, okay, let's get into these ones. First, these are from Freud and post Freudian psychoanalysis, including his daughter, Anna Freud, who developed some of these defense mechanisms as well. So, projection is attributing your own unacceptable feelings to someone else, right? So this is when you say, it's not me, it's them, right? An example is a person who feels envy and then says, they're jealous of me, right? That's projection. So what you can't see in yourself or what you can't recognize in yourself, you say that others have it, right? The internal feeling is displaced outward, right? Function, or what does this do to you? It reduces anxiety by externalizing the conflict onto other people, right? Identification is the opposite of projection. So, identification is when you're psychologically aligning yourself with another person. Excuse me. We're going to get into observational learning in a little bit, but this is when you say things like, I become like them, right? An example, it would be a child imitates a strong parent to feel safe, or an employer adopts the values of their boss, right? It is not necessarily defensive, it can be developmental. And this is the interesting part because a lot of, well, not a lot of, but some defense mechanisms like sublimation, even repression, I was seeing. So repressing something for a little bit can be healthy, right? Like such as when you can't attend to it or when you can't tend to it. So it would be functional to repress your feelings for a moment and then later, come back and revisit them. Sublimation, of course, is one of the best defense mechanisms because you turn that which is unacceptable by society and by moral standards acceptable. So sublimation is a whole another ball game, and it's very interesting. But in this case, when you identify with someone, you are not necessarily being defensive. It can be even like it says here, like when you're learning something, you need to identify. You need a role model. You need someone to look up to. You need a teacher. You need an instructor. You need a guide to tell you how to do things, right? So identification is also very interesting because we can say it takes place a lot during teenage years or during adolescence because that's when teenagers are trying to figure out who they are, right? Based on Eric Erickson's theory, psychosocial theory, one of the main events during your teenage years is your identity, is the development of your identity. Now, where this gets a little bit complicated is with introjection, because introjection and identification sound similar, right? So introjection would be kind of the opposite also of projection, because what you project onto others in this case, you are going to make part of yourself, but this is kind of bad. It's not as healthy as identification. So introjection is internalizing aspects of another person as part of the self, as part of yourself, right? Mechanism is they become part of me internally. So an example would be a child internalizes a parent's voice, right? Such as, you must always be perfect. Even when the parent is absent, that voice remains. And it's very interesting because with Freud's theory, Freud's concepts of the ID or the id, the superego and the ego, we can say that the id is always there, right? That impulsive animal that we all have, which could even be associated with the shadow of Carl Jung, right? Like the bad part of us. The ego is that mediator between these two forces, and the other force would be the superego, which is kind of like the moral compass or this moral direction of how things should be. Now, what's interesting is the superego, because the superego is not there from the beginning. When you're an infant or a baby or a kid, you're not moral, like you're not considering others, right? So that gets developed by your parents, by your guardians, and your superego has a developmental process. So that analyzing the development of the superego is super interesting because this type of introjection, I think, happens, which we're going to get into with Melanie Klein in a little bit. But anyway, let's look at the difference between identification and introjection. So they are related but not identical. Identification is a process of modeling oneself after another, right? More relational and behavioral, can be conscious, and has to do with vicarious or observational learning by theory developed by Albert Bandura, which is like what you see, you do, right? So it's like, I saw on TV that they wrestle, so I wrestle. I saw my mom do this, so now I do this, right? So it's just like behavioral. It is you're identifying with it, but it's almost like healthy, right? It's not like deeper. Now, introjection is deep internal absorption. The other becomes an internal psychic structure, often unconscious, and can form the superego, like I mentioned earlier. Simplified, identification says, I act like them, and introjection says, they live inside my psyche, right? So it's like deeper and can be more dangerous if it's not socially acceptable, or if the things that are being introjected are not socially acceptable, right? Now, the difference between projection and introjection would be that projection, like I mentioned, is from the inside to the outside, while introjection is the opposite. It's from the outside to the inside. So they are psychological opposites structurally, right? The deep conceptual distinction is that projection and introjection regulate psychic boundaries. Um, Projection pushes anxiety outward, and introjection pulls authority in, right? Identification reshapes the ego through alignment. So, identification is different from projection and introjection in that identification has to do with the ego, and projection and introjection have to do more with impulses or these emotional physiological responses, more unconscious psychoanalytical ideas. um, Introjection, I was also thinking about, well, not introjection, maybe identification, like when Eminem started making music and a lot of people felt identified with him, or even the Backstreet Boys, or to this day a lot of like rappers, singers, artists, the fans will constantly say like, it's just, I feel the same way, right? So they identify with those people, right? Or with those artists. Now, the theory of mind is interesting because this is where the difference with theory of mind comes into play. Now, let's just review. Introjection is from psychoanalysis, and it comes from the psychoanalytic theory, Freud, later object relations theorist. It is a defense mechanism, and it's basically the unconscious internalization of another person's traits, voice, values, attitudes into one's own psychic structure, right? So the outside becomes part of the inside. An example, a child with a very critical parent grows up hearing internally, you're not good enough. Even when the parent is absent, that voice remains as part of the superego, right? It is emotional, structural, identity forming, and often unconscious, and introjection changes who you are internally. Mm. Now, the theory of mind is from cognitive psychology. ToM, theory of mind, ToM, belongs to developmental and cognitive psychology. It's necessary for complex communication, but not for pragmatic competence, like simple requests or alarming someone of something. Um, this means that, like, you don't need theory of mind in a nutshell is like putting yourself in other people's shoes conceptually and mentally. You don't need to do that to communicate to others, because you can just be greedy or egotistical or selfish and be like me, and communicate your needs to others and just get them to give you what you want. But in order to consider other people and have complex communications, you would need the theory of mind, right? But it's not essential for communication, is what I'm trying to say. So it refers to the ability to understand that other people have their own thoughts, beliefs, intentions, and perspectives. It is a cognitive capacity, not a defense mechanism, right? An example is you realize she looks angry, but maybe she misunderstood what I said, right? So you make these interpretations or you infer these ideas, right? You are modeling her mental state. So it is cognitive, perspective taking, predictive, about understanding others, right? Theory of mind, or ToM, does not mean you absorb the other person. It means you mentally represent them. The core difference with introjection is that in introjection, you internalize the other as part of your psychic structure, right? Whereas in theory of mind, you simulate, so there's distance, right? You simulate or infer the other's mental state while maintaining psychological separation, right? The structural comparison here would be introjection is psychoanalytical, it's a defense mechanism, it's unconscious, it's identity forming, and the catchphrase or the phrase here would be they become part of me. Whereas in theory of mind, it's from cognitive developmental psychology, it's a cognitive ability, it's usually conscious, it's perspective taking, and it's in one phrase or in a nutshell, as in I understand what they think, right? Simple metaphor, in introjection, someone moves into your house permanently. In theory of mind, you visit someone else's house mentally and then return home, right? Which is kind of like a nice analogy. Why they sometimes get confused? Because both involve internal representation of another person, but introjection is incorporation, whereas theory of mind is a simulation, right? So one reshapes the self, right? And the other just models the other person, right? The other models the other, the other models the other. Now, we're going to check out the introjection in Kleinian theory. In Melanie Klein's theory, introjection is not just about internalizing a voice, it is part of how the psychic it is part of how the psyche is built from infancy. So this is a very interesting take. The core idea is that the infant relates not to whole person, or the infant relates not to whole people at first, but to internal objects, right? So an object can be an emotional or a mental emotional representation of a person or part of a person. For Klein, a baby, for example, projects feelings into the mother, right? And then takes in experiences of the mother. So they introject that, right? This process builds the internal world, which is very interesting. So it's like the way that I communicate with people is that I'm going to project what I think, my emotions, my feelings onto other people, and then I'm going to introject what they perceive, right? So it's like this cycle of projection, introjection, projection, introjection, right? It's kind of interesting. In Kleinian version, introjection is the internal taking in of a good object or a bad object into the psyche. Example, if the caregiver feels soothing and reliable, the infant internalizes a good breast, right? Like symbolically. If the caregiver feels frustrating or absent, the infant internalizes a bad object, right? These internal objects later become inner comfort, inner persecution, anxiety, guilt, and self structure. Introjection here is emotional, primitive, and structural, and it shapes the entire psychic architecture, right? So, from the perspective of theory of mind, or putting theory of mind again into the mix, like we said, it's the capacity to understand that others have independent mental states. It develops around the age of 4 or 5 in most children, and it is about recognizing false beliefs, understanding perspective differences, and predicting behavior. So it is a cognitive achievement, sort of say. Um, so this idea that you have other people that are having their own ideas presupposes that you shouldn't presuppose that they know what you're talking about, right? Which is like a theory, like an idea that I saw somewhere. Assume zero context. When you're talking about something, you're talking from your point of view, from what you know, from your background, but you have to assume that other people don't have that same background. They have their own background, they have their own ideas and beliefs, right? Where I think the best thing would be to like ask, like, do you know this stuff? Um, and it can be a problem in communication because you're assuming things that the other person may not know, right? Um, Fundamental difference with a Kleinian lens is that the introjection for Klein, it occurs in infancy. It's pre-verbal, it's precognitive, it's emotional and unconscious, and it builds the internal object world, right? Whereas theory of mind develops later, it's cognitive and representational. It requires symbolic thought. Does not reshape internal structure, right? Because you can just understand, and it allows perspective taking. That I understand you, but I don't feel you is essential, right? Because I was learning yesterday that in order to really learn something, you need to feel it, right? To a certain extent. If you don't feel it and you just simply understand it, you may not learn it really, right? The deep structural differences is, or the difference is that in Klein, the infant does not initially experience others as fully separated subjects. Um, yeah, which was a theory, like the infant perceives itself as part of the whole, part of everything. So there is primitive splitting. The good object, we could say, is like from based on Epicurus's ideas of pleasure and pain. The good object, pleasure, and the bad object, pain, right? The internal world is built through projection and introjection. In theory of mind, the child already recognizes self and other as separate, and others have mind. So ToM assumes separation, and Klein describes a stage before stable separation, right? Which is that building, like it says here, of that internal world through projection and introjection. Another crucial distinction would be that introjection is tied to paranoid, schizoid positioning or position, depressive position, internal object relations, and anxiety regulation, whereas theory of mind is tied to cognitive development, executive function, language, and social reasoning. So they are different domains entirely, right? Example to make this concrete, the scenario is a child's mother leaves the room. In Kleinian introjection, the child's reaction depends on the internalized object, right? Which I could say is like the past experience of that child. If the child, excuse me, if the child has a stable, good internal object, they tolerate the separation. If they are dominated by persecutory internal objects, they experience abandonment anxiety, right? Which we could get into that. That's very interesting. Theory of mind would be the child thinks mom left to get something, she will return. That's perspective taking. Introjection shapes emotional security, and theory of mind shapes cognitive understanding. A simple metaphor would be for introjection from Klein, building the architecture of the internal house, right? And for theory of mind, learning how to look through the window into someone else's house, right? One constructs the psyche, and the other navigates social cognition, right? Complex social cognition. Okay, and the important clinical insight would be from a Kleinian perspective, a person can have strong theory of mind but unstable internal objects, meaning they may they may intellectually understand others, but emotionally react from persecutory internal dynamics. So they may have cognitive therapy, but not emotional security, right? So that's kind of like the difference there.